The day the divorce was finalized, she walked out of that courtroom with a quiet kind of confidence that only comes from believing you've secured everything that matters, every asset, every account. Every visible piece of a life that once belonged to two people, but had now been legally reduced to ownership and entitlement. And she didn't just win, she made sure it felt final, like there was nothing left to question, nothing left to claim. Nothing left hidden beneath the surface that could challenge what had just been decided. But what she didn't understand, what she never even paused to consider, was that the most valuable parts of a life are rarely the ones that get listed in documents or argued over in courtrooms. Because those things are visible, measurable, easy to define, and anything that fits into that system can be controlled, divided, and taken. But the things that don't fit into that structure, the things that exist quietly outside of attention, those are the ones people overlook, dismiss, and ultimately underestimate. And as she signed the final paper and walked away without looking back, already stepping into a future she believed she had secured completely, I realized something that shifted everything about that moment, because while she believed she had taken everything, the truth was far more unsettling. She had taken everything that didn't matter and left behind the only thing that did. The process leading up to that day wasn't chaotic or emotional in the way people expect divorce to be. It was structured, calculated, and executed with a level of precision that removed any unpredictability from the outcome, because she approached it like a strategy rather than a loss, aligning herself with advice that focused on maximizing what could be gained while minimizing what could be questioned, ensuring that every visible asset was accounted for and transferred in a way that favored her completely. And I didn't resist. Not in the way she expected, not in a way that would create friction or delay the process, because resistance invites attention, and attention exposes details before they're ready to be seen, and I understood that the advantage I held depended entirely on something remaining outside, that attention, something that wouldn't appear significant enough to matter. And while she interpreted my silence as weakness, as resignation, as proof that I had already accepted defeat, I was simply allowing the process to move exactly where it needed to go, because the outcome she was building was already incomplete, even if she couldn't see it yet. From the outside it looked like I had given up completely, like I had allowed years of work to be redistributed without protecting anything that truly mattered, and that perception worked in my favor more than anything else, because when someone believes they've already won, they stop looking deeper. They stop questioning details. They stop searching for anything that doesn't fit neatly into the structure of their victory, and that's exactly what happened. She focused entirely on what could be seen, measured, and legally transferred properties, accounts, investments, while completely ignoring the one element that didn't fit into that system, something that had existed quietly for years, something that didn't demand attention, didn't appear valuable, and most importantly, didn't create urgency during the division process, and that single oversight. That assumption that something insignificant didn't matter became the foundation of everything that followed, because in situations like this, the most dangerous thing isn't what people take. It's what they leave behind without understanding its importance. Because the box wasn't just something forgotten in a corner of a room. It wasn't just storage or a collection of items that had no place in the structured system she relied on. It was something far more intentional than that, something designed not to stand out, not to attract attention, not to trigger curiosity, because anything that draws attention too early becomes part of the process, and once something becomes part of the process, it can be evaluated, questioned, and ultimately controlled, and the entire purpose of the box was to remain outside of that, to exist quietly in a space where it would be seen but never truly noticed, acknowledged but never examined. And over the years it had done exactly that, becoming part of the background of our lives in a way that made it effectively invisible, and that invisibility wasn't accidental. It was the reason it worked. It sat in the same place for years untouched, unremarkable, blending into the environment so completely that it never triggered a second thought, something she had walked past countless times without ever asking what it contained or why it was still there. Because in a world where value is associated with visibility, anything that appears ordinary is automatically dismissed. And that's what made it so effective, because the most powerful things are often the ones people don't consider important enough to question. And while everything else in our lives was being documented, evaluated, and eventually divided during the divorce, the box remained outside of that process entirely, not because it was hidden, but because it was ignored, and that difference made it more secure than anything she had fought so hard to take. Because what people overlook is often what they never prepare for. After the divorce, she moved with the kind of urgency that comes from believing everything is finally within reach, transferring ownerships, consolidating accounts, reorganizing assets in a way that reflected absolute control. And from the outside it looked flawless, like every detail had been accounted for and secured, like there was no room left for error or oversight, and I let her move that way. I didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't challenge anything she was doing. Because the version of reality she was managing was already incomplete, even if she didn't realize it yet. And the more confident she became in that illusion of total control, the less likely she was to question the one thing that sat outside of it, untouched and unnoticed. Waiting for the exact moment when it would no longer be possible to ignore, because confidence, when built on incomplete information, doesn't protect you. It blinds you, and that blindness is what allows everything else to unfold exactly the way it was meant to. The first sign that something wasn't right didn't come from anything obvious. There was no dramatic discovery, no sudden realization, just a small inconsistency, something so minor that most people would have dismissed it without a second thought, but in a system she believed was perfect. Even a small inconsistency felt out of place, and it started with a routine call, something simple, something procedural, a verification request tied to one of the assets she thought was fully under her control, and when she responded. When she tried to confirm something that should have been straightforward, the answer she received didn't match what she expected. Not completely, not enough to panic, but enough to pause, and that pause, that brief moment of hesitation, was the beginning of everything unraveling. Because once certainty is interrupted even slightly, the mind doesn't let it go. It circles back, it questions, it searches for alignment, and when it doesn't find it, it starts looking deeper. At first she tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a minor error, something administrative, something that could be corrected with a follow-up call or a simple clarification. Because accepting that something was fundamentally wrong would mean accepting that her control wasn't as complete as she believed, and that's not something people do easily, especially when they've just secured what they think is a victory. But the inconsistency didn't resolve itself. It lingered. Subtle but persistent, forcing her to revisit documents, recheck details, retrace steps that she thought were already finalized, and the more she looked, the more she noticed small misalignments, nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to create a pattern, and once a pattern forms, it becomes impossible to ignore, because patterns suggest intention, and intention means something exists beneath the surface that hasn't been accounted for. That's when her attention shifted not outward but inward toward the details she had previously overlooked. The parts of the process she had assumed were irrelevant, and as she moved through the house reviewing everything again with a different mindset, the environment itself started to change, not physically but perceptually, because once you start looking for something you might have missed, everything becomes a potential answer. Every object, every space, every detail takes on a new level of significance, and that's when the box, the same box that had been sitting in the corner for years without meaning anything, suddenly became something else entirely, not because it had changed, but because because now she wasn't looking at it as background, she was looking at it as possibility, and that shift, that change in perception, is what transforms something invisible into something unavoidable. She didn't open it immediately, and that hesitation wasn't accidental. It came from something deeper, something instinctive, because part of her already understood that whatever was inside that box wasn't going to confirm what she believed it was going to challenge it. And people don't rush into moments that might dismantle their sense of control. They delay them. They create reasons to look elsewhere, first to check other explanations, to exhaust every alternative before confronting the one thing that feels uncertain. But the more she searched, the more those alternatives disappeared, one by one, leaving fewer and fewer explanations that made sense. Until eventually there was only one thing left that hadn't been examined, one detail that had remained outside the process from the beginning, and at that point opening the box wasn't a choice anymore, it was a necessity. When she finally walked toward it, The movement itself carried a weight that hadn't been there before, slow, deliberate, not because she was unsure of what she was doing, but because she understood that whatever she found inside would define everything that came next, and as she reached down and lifted the lid. There was no dramatic reveal, no sudden shock, just a quiet realization that what she was looking at wasn't random, wasn't forgotten, wasn't meaningless. It was organized, structured in a way that immediately signaled intention, and that's when the first real shift happened. Because structure implies purpose, and purpose implies value, and value means she had overlooked something that should have mattered. Inside the box wasn't clutter, it wasn't old memories or insignificant items stored away without thought. It was something far more precise than that. Documents arranged in a way that told a story, timelines that connected events, agreements that existed outside the system she had relied on, and each piece she uncovered didn't just add information. It changed context. It redefined what ownership actually meant, because what she had taken, what she had fought for and secured through the divorce, was based on a structure she believed was complete. But the structure inside that box suggested something entirely different, something that existed beyond what had been presented in court, beyond what had been documented officially. And, as she continued to go through it, the realization didn't hit all at once. It built gradually, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. Every page she turned added another layer to that realization, showing connections she hadn't seen before, agreements that altered the meaning of what she thought she owned. And the deeper she went, the clearer it became that what she had secured wasn't the full picture. It was only the visible part of something much larger, something that had been structured carefully over time, not to be hidden, but to remain outside the process entirely. And that's what made it so effective, because anything outside the process doesn't get evaluated, doesn't get questioned, and ultimately doesn't get transferred. And that's when it hit her. She didn't take everything. She took what I wanted her to take. That realization didn't come with panic at first, it came with silence. A stillness that happens when the mind is trying to process something that doesn't fit into its existing framework. Because up until that moment, everything had made sense. Everything had followed a logical structure. But now that structure was breaking, and when structure breaks, control disappears with it, and the more she tried to piece it together, the more she understood that the outcome she believed she had secured had been shaped long before the divorce even began, not through confrontation, not through resistance, but through placement, through positioning, through allowing certain things to be seen and others to be ignored. And in that moment, standing there with the contents of that box laid out in front of her, she realized that what she thought was an ending was actually the beginning of something she had never prepared for. She sat there longer than she expected, the documents spread out in front of her, no longer feeling like simple pieces of paper, but fragments of something much larger, something she hadn't accounted for, and the more she tried to organize them in her mind, the more she realized they weren't meant to be understood all at once. They were layered, intentionally revealing meaning only when seen together, and that was the part that unsettled her the most, because this wasn't accidental, this wasn't something forgotten or misplaced. It was designed to be discovered only after everything else had already been finalized, after every decision had been locked in, after there was no easy way to reverse anything. And that timing, that precision, forced her to confront a possibility she hadn't considered before. That the outcome she had fought for so aggressively had been anticipated long before she even initiated the process, and not just anticipated, but guided. Shaped in a way that ensured she would focus on the wrong things while ignoring the only thing that actually mattered. The first real wave of pressure didn't come from what she saw, but from what it implied, because implication is harder to control than facts. Facts can be argued, explained, dismissed. But implications linger. They connect dots whether you want them to or not. And as she sat there looking at agreements that didn't appear anywhere in the official records, timelines that suggested decisions had been made years in advance, she began to feel something she hadn't felt throughout the entire divorce process. Uncertainty, not about the documents themselves, but about her own understanding of everything that had happened. Because if this existed, if this had always been there, then what else had she missed? What else had she assumed was complete when it wasn't? And once that question enters your mind, it doesn't leave it, expands, forcing you to reconsider everything you thought you knew. She reached for her phone more than once, instinctively wanting to call someone, a lawyer, an advisor. Anyone who could give her clarity, but each time she stopped, because explaining this wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be a quick conversation or an easy answer. It would require context, and context meant admitting that something had been overlooked. And admitting that meant accepting that control had never been as complete as she believed, and that's not something people do easily, especially when their identity in that moment is tied to the idea of having won. But the longer she sat there, the more that identity began to shift, not fully, not yet, but enough to create discomfort, enough to make her realize that whatever this was, it wasn't going to stay contained inside that box. Because power doesn't disappear all at once. It shifts gradually, almost quietly, until one moment you realize it's no longer where you thought it was, and as she went through the contents again, slower this time, more carefully, she started to notice something she hadn't seen before. Not just what was included, but what was missing, because in a collection this deliberate absence is just as important as presence, and the gaps, the spaces where something should have been, but wasn't suggested that this wasn't everything. It was only part of it, a controlled reveal. Enough to change her understanding, but not enough to give her full clarity, and that realization created a different kind of tension, because now she wasn't just reacting to what she had found, she was aware that there was more she couldn't see. That awareness changed everything about how she approached the situation, because now it wasn't about confirming what she had. It was about finding what she didn't, and that shift in focus is where control begins to slip, because when you start searching for something unknown, you lose the ability to define the boundaries of the situation, and without boundaries, everything becomes uncertain, and uncertainty creates vulnerability, and for the first time since the divorce began, she wasn't operating from a position of certainty anymore. She was reacting, trying to catch up to something that had already been set in motion long before she realized it existed. She went back through every document from the divorce, every agreement, every clause, every detail she had once reviewed with complete confidence, but now those same pages felt different. Not because they had changed, but because her understanding of them had, and that's what made it so unsettling, because nothing was technically wrong. Nothing had been hidden in a way that could be challenged legally. Everything she had received was exactly what had been presented. Exactly what had been agreed upon, and yet somehow it still felt incomplete, like she had been handed a version of reality that was accurate, but not whole, and the more she tried to align what she had with what she had just discovered, the more that gap between them grew, until it became impossible to ignore. And that's when she realized something that shifted her perspective completely. This wasn't about taking something from her. It wasn't about dissection and the way she understood it. It was about direction. About guiding her attention towards specific outcomes while allowing her to believe those outcomes were entirely her own decisions, and that realization was far more unsettling than any hidden asset or undisclosed agreement could have been, because it meant that the control she believed she had exercised throughout the process might not have been control at all. It might have been influence, subtle, precise, and completely invisible until now. The more she thought about it, the more moments began to resurface. Conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time, decisions that felt like her own, but now seemed slightly aligned, as if they had been nudged in a specific direction without her noticing, and those realizations didn't come all at once. They came in fragments, each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. And once that pattern became clear, the situation changed entirely, because now she wasn't just dealing with something she had missed, she was dealing with the possibility that she had been guided toward missing it. That thought stayed with her as she looked back at the box, at what remained inside it, because now it didn't feel like a discovery. It felt like a message, something left intentionally to be found at exactly this moment, not earlier, not later, but now, when everything had already been finalized. When there was no simple way to undo anything, and that timing, that precision made it impossible to dismiss as coincidence, because coincidences don't organize themselves this carefully. They don't align this perfectly with outcomes that have already been secured. And for the first time, she considered the possibility that the entire process, everything she believed she had controlled, might have been part of a much larger structure, one where her actions, her decisions, even her confidence had all contributed to an outcome that had been defined long before she realized it. And that realization didn't come with clarity. It came with a different kind of uncertainty, one that doesn't ask what happened, but why it was allowed to happen this way in the first place. She stood up slowly, the room feeling different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because her perception of it had, and once perception shifts, nothing feels the same again. Familiar spaces start to feel unfamiliar, ordinary details begin to carry weight. And that's what she was experiencing now, a quiet transformation of understanding that made everything around her feel slightly off, slightly misaligned, as if she had stepped into a version of reality that looked the same but operated differently. The box was no longer just an object. It had become a starting point, a trigger for something much larger, something that extended beyond what she could see, and the more she thought about it, the more she understood that whatever this was, it wasn't finished. It wasn't something that ended with discovery. It was something that continued beyond it, something that would unfold further the moment she tried to act on it. And that realization created a new kind of tension, because now every decision she made moving forward carried uncertainty. Because acting without full information is risky. But not acting at all can be even worse, and she was caught between those two options, unsure whether moving forward would give her clarity or make things worse. And that hesitation, that moment of pause, was something she hadn't experienced before during the entire process, because before this, every step had felt clear, defined, intentional, but now for the first time she was stepping into something she didn't fully understand. And that's when she realized something that changed everything again. The box wasn't the problem. It was proof that what she had taken wasn't everything. Proof that what she believed was complete was only partial, and most importantly proof that the outcome she was living in now had been shaped in ways she had never seen. And once something becomes proof, it can't be ignored. It demands action. It forces decisions. And as she stood there, holding that realization, she understood that whatever came next wasn't going to be about recovering what she thought she had lost. It was going to be about confronting something far more complex, something that had been waiting quietly, patiently for this exact moment to begin. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to slow down, replaying every detail, every decision, every moment that had led her here, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that reacting impulsively would only push her further into a situation she didn't fully understand. So instead of acting, she did something she hadn't done throughout the entire divorce process. She paused, not out of hesitation, but out of strategy. Because if this had been constructed deliberately, if everything she had just discovered was part of something larger, then rushing forward would only mean stepping into something already prepared for her, and that realization forced her into a different mindset entirely. One where she wasn't trying to regain control immediately, but trying to understand where control actually existed now, because without that understanding, any move she made would only confirm what had already been anticipated. For the first time, she stopped thinking like someone who had won, and started thinking like someone who had been outplayed, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything about how she approached the situation, because now it wasn't about defending what she had, it was about uncovering what she didn't. And that meant going deeper, looking beyond the surface of everything she thought she understood, questioning details she had previously accepted without hesitation, and most importantly stepping outside the version of reality she had been operating in, because whatever this was, it existed beyond that framework, and if she wanted to regain control, she would have to meet it there. Her first move wasn't confrontation, it was silence, because silence gives you space, and space allows things to reveal themselves naturally, and if there was more to this, if the box was only the beginning, then reacting too quickly would only disrupt whatever pattern was still unfolding. So instead of calling, instead of asking questions, she waited, watching for anything that might shift, any detail that might change, now that the box had been opened. And that waiting wasn't passive, it was intentional controlled, because sometimes the most powerful move isn't action, it's observation. And something did shift, not immediately, not in a way that was obvious but subtle enough to be noticed if you were paying attention, small changes in communication delays where there hadn't been any before, responses that felt slightly different, not incorrect, just adjusted, and those adjustments, minor as they seemed, confirmed something important. This wasn't static. It wasn't something that had ended with the divorce. It was still active, still evolving, and that meant one thing. Whatever structure had been put in place wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about what was still to come. That realization gave her something she hadn't had before: direction. Not complete clarity, but enough to start moving with intention again. And the first place she returned to wasn't the documents, wasn't the legal side of things. It was the timeline. Because timelines don't lie, they reveal patterns. They show when things started, when they shifted, when decisions were made. And as she reconstructed everything from the beginning, she started to see something that hadn't been clear before. This didn't start with the divorce. It started long before that. Quietly, gradually, in ways that didn't stand out at the time, but now formed a sequence that was impossible to ignore. The investments that seemed ordinary weren't random. The transfers that looked routine weren't routine. And the box wasn't storage. It was a checkpoint. That's when the structure finally began to take shape in her mind. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough to understand its purpose. It wasn't about hiding something. It was about separating it, placing it outside the system she relied on, outside the process she trusted, so that when everything was divided, when everything visible was taken, what actually mattered would remain untouched. And that realization changed everything about how she viewed the outcome, because now it wasn't just incomplete. It was intentional, designed to look complete while being fundamentally partial. And for the first time since opening the box, something else replaced uncertainty: intent. She wasn't going to confront directly, not yet, because confrontation without full understanding only benefits the person who already has the advantage. And she knew now that she wasn't operating from that position anymore. So instead, she decided to do something different, something calculated. She would follow the structure, not fight it. She would move through it the same way it had been built, quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention to what she was actually trying to uncover, because if this had been designed with precision, then the only way to break it was to match that precision. So she played along, not as someone trying to fix a mistake, but as someone pretending not to see it. Days passed. And on the surface nothing changed. Everything looked exactly the same routines, the same structures, the same sense of control she had displayed before. But underneath that surface everything was different, because now every action she took had a second layer to it. Every decision carried intention beyond what could be seen, and that duality, that separation between appearance and reality, was what allowed her to move without being detected, because when people believe nothing has changed, they stop watching closely. But the deeper she went, the clearer it became that this wasn't something she could fully reverse. Not completely, because whatever had been put in place wasn't just about ownership. It was about positioning, about ensuring that even if discovered, it couldn't simply be undone without consequences. And that realization forced her into a difficult position, because now the question wasn't whether she could take back control. It was how much control was actually recoverable. And that's when she understood something that changed the direction of everything again. This wasn't about getting everything back. It was about not losing more, because the more she uncovered, the more she realized that what had already been secured wasn't necessarily stable. It depended on things she hadn't seen before, connections that could shift if the structure around them changed. And that meant one wrong move could cost her more than she had already lost. The box hadn't just revealed the past, it had exposed the future. At that point, the situation wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about timing, about choosing the right moment to act. Because acting too early would mean stepping into something unfinished, but waiting too long could mean losing the opportunity entirely. And that balance, that narrow space between action and patience, is where everything becomes decided, not by force, not by confrontation, but by precision. And then she made her move. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't involve confrontation or accusations. It was something much simpler, much more controlled. A single adjustment placed exactly where it would have the most impact. Not enough to reveal everything she knew, but enough to disrupt the structure just slightly. Enough to force a response, and that response was all she needed, because responses reveal patterns. They show where pressure exists, where control is being maintained, and most importantly, where it can be broken. And in that moment, she finally saw it. Not the box, not the documents, but the system behind it all. Everything connected, every detail, every decision, every moment that had once seemed separate, now aligned into a single structure, one that had been built carefully over time, not just to protect something, but to ensure it couldn't be taken even under pressure. Even under legal scrutiny and understanding, that didn't give her control back, but it gave her something else. Awareness, and awareness, when used correctly, can be just as powerful as control itself. Because in the end, she didn't lose because she took everything. She lost because she never understood what everything actually was. After that moment, everything slowed down in a way that didn't feel natural, like the situation itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, and she understood why. Because the move she had just made wasn't meant to resolve anything immediately. It was meant to reveal, to expose how the system would react under pressure. And as she stepped back and observed the response, she realized something that shifted her understanding once again. The structure she was dealing with wasn't fragile. It didn't collapse under pressure. It adjusted, it adapted, and that adaptability was what made it dangerous, because something that adapts doesn't break easily. It evolves, and once something begins to evolve, predicting its behavior becomes significantly more difficult, and that meant whatever she was dealing with wasn't just a plan. It was a framework, something designed to continue functioning even when challenged. That realization changed how she felt about everything, not just the situation, but herself within it, because up until now she had been trying to regain control, to return to a position she believed she had lost. But now she understood that there was no return. There was only forward, only adaptation. And that meant letting go of the idea that she could undo what had already been done, because the past wasn't something she could rewrite, it was something she had to work around, and accepting that wasn't easy because it required a shift in identity from someone who believed she had control to someone who had to rebuild it from a completely different starting point. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that the real impact of what had happened wasn't financial. It wasn't about assets or ownership or anything that could be measured in numbers. It was psychological. It was about perception, about understanding how easily control can be constructed, how easily it can be believed, and how quickly it can shift when the foundation it's built on is incomplete, and that realization stayed with her, not as fear, but as awareness. Because once you see something like that clearly, you don't unsee it. It changes how you approach everything moving forward. And that's when she understood the real purpose of the box. It wasn't to hide anything. It was to teach something. Every document, every detail, every carefully placed piece of information inside it wasn't just part of a structure. It was part of a message, one that only made sense after everything else had already been decided. And that message wasn't about what she had missed. It was about how she had missed it. About the assumptions she had made, the things she had prioritized, the way she had defined value based only on what was visible, and understanding that didn't change the outcome, but it changed her perspective of it entirely, for the first time since the divorce. She didn't feel anger, she felt clarity. And clarity in a situation like this is more powerful than reaction, because a reaction is immediate, emotional, often misdirected, but clarity is controlled. It allows you to see not just what happened, but why it happened, and once you understand the why, the need to react disappears, replaced by something more measured, more intentional. And that's where she found herself now, no longer trying to fight what had already been decided, but understanding it well enough to move beyond it. Because the truth was simple. Even if it had taken this long to see it, she didn't lose everything. She lost the illusion of control. And that illusion, more than anything else, had shaped her decisions, her confidence, her approach to the entire situation, and losing it didn't leave her empty. It left her aware of how easily perception can be influenced, how easily outcomes can be shaped without direct force, and that awareness became something she could actually use, something that gave her a different kind of advantage, moving forward not over the past, but over whatever came next. She closed the box slowly, not with frustration, not with regret, but with understanding, because at that point it wasn't something she needed to keep open anymore. Everything it had to show her had already been revealed, and keeping it open wouldn't change anything. It would only keep her tied to a moment that had already served its purpose, and moving forward required letting that moment stay where it belonged. The house felt different after that, not because anything had physically changed, but because her relationship to it had. It was no longer a symbol of what she had won, it was a reminder of what she had misunderstood, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed how she saw everything around her, not with disappointment, but with a level of awareness she hadn't had before. Because in the end, this was never about the house, or the money, or the divorce. It was about perception, about understanding that what you see is rarely the full picture, and that the things you don't question are often the ones that matter the most, and that lesson, unlike anything else in this situation, was something she could actually take with her, something that wouldn't be divided, transferred, or lost. And that's the part people don't realize. You don't lose when someone takes something from you. You lose when you misunderstand what actually mattered. Looking back, she could see it clearly now, the moments where she had focused too much on outcomes and not enough on structure, the decisions that felt right at the time, but were based on incomplete understanding, and seeing that didn't change the past, but it changed how she would approach the future. And sometimes that's the only thing that actually matters. Because once you've been through something like this, you don't think the same way again. You question more, you observe more, you look beyond what's presented to you, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because you've seen what happens when you don't. And that awareness becomes part of how you move forward, not as a weakness, but as a strength. And as she walked away from that room, leaving the box exactly where it had always been, it didn't feel unfinished. It felt complete, not because everything had been resolved, but because everything that needed to be understood had been. Because in the end, she didn't walk away with everything. She walked away with something far more dangerous, the ability to never be outplayed again.